Welcome to Real Dudes Podcast. We have a awesome guest with us today from California, part of a small team that put out a big game that really hit me hard last year. Before I introduce him real quick, I do have Carrington with me.
Hey.
And we've got Ian Dallas with us from Giant Sparrow Games. They have worked on The Unfinished Swan and What Remains of Edith Finch. Ian, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing real good. We are so glad that you were able to take time out of your schedule to come on here and chat with us a little bit.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah. So really just kind of getting into this, why not tell us about yourself and what you do within the gaming industry?
I am the creative director at Giant Sparrow. So I come up with the initial ideas for the games that we make and then work on prototypes for them and then kind of manage the team. And, eventually at some point when everything is going well, I'm the guy that goes out and does podcasts, among other things, to drum up support for the game.
Very nice. Thank you very much for being on the show with us today.
Sure.
So before you worked with Giant Sparrow and you were the creative director, did you always work in the gaming industry or did you do something else?
Initially, I started as a comedy writer. As a graphic designer, and then a comedy writer at The Onion, and then I moved to LA to work in comedy writing for television. And then my first job in the games industry was actually as a tester on Tribe's Vengeance and some other less memorable games. And after a little bit in the QA salt mines, my next job was as a intern / writer at Telltale Games, working on the Sam and Max series.
Oh my gosh, I love that. That is amazing.
Oh yeah, cool. I was on season 2 for the first 2 episodes. And then I went back to grad school for game development and dropped out of grad school after I made this prototype for a paint splatting game called, at the time I guess it was called The Unfinished Swan. And then it got a publishing deal with Sony. And I've been working at Giant Sparrow ever since.
Very cool. You've had quite the journey over the years.
Yeah, it's meandered a bit, but happy to be where I am.
So, was there an actual point throughout this whole process that you're like, this is what I want to do for my career, the rest of my life?
Not really. There was a point where I said, this is what I don't want to do. I was in television and in college, I graduated in 2000. I didn't really have a good sense of what the game industry was like, but I thought that I would be a writer for video games. And at the time, games weren't really at a point where they needed writers. And I thought, I'll just kind of cool out for a while. I'll be a writer in television, which seemed really fun. And then eventually, when games kind of catch up and need writers, I will be there, and then I'll jump to being a writer for games, which is the thing that I really loved as a medium. And so I was in TV for a little while, and there was a day where I looked around the room and I realized, as I was the lowest writer in the room, I don't want any of your jobs. There's nobody who I wanted to move up and become. And it was really fun being in television. You just kind of make jokes all day, basically. You have a script and you try to make it better as a group. And it's like a whole room full of just class clowns. But I kind of had done that for a while and felt like I really want to make video games. But video games never got to that point, and I don't think they ever will be at that point where they really need writers in the same way that TV or movies do. It's just not a writer-driven medium. And I had been doing graphic design stuff and was pretty comfortable with, computer things in general, and taught myself a bit of programming and decided, why not just go back to school and learn how to do more of this. And it turned out that I really liked all the aspects of making video games. And so, I started making prototypes, and then the rest, kind of took off.
Sweet. It definitely sounds like a busy process to get to the point to where you're at now.
It's been a convoluted journey.
Yeah, but definitely worth it with the stuff that you guys have made.
It's been very rewarding.
So, being a game developer, how is it, to create a video game? So at work, you are making video games. At home, do you play video games? Or are you kind of like that, like, I don't want to talk about this after I'm done working, or...
Yeah, I mean, it comes and goes.
Okay.
There are definitely periods where, when I'm spending more time and energy making a game that I really just don't have the bandwidth. Like every moment that I'm not, at the office, I'm basically like trying to spend with my girlfriend to make up for the time that I've been away. And trying to live a regular life. So, there were months that would go by and I really wouldn't play that many games. And then certainly after we finished What Remains of Edith Finch, I sat down and I played lots of games that have been on my list and, meaning to get around to. And, I think in the very beginning, I had a really strong interest in playing games, like as a 10-year-old or whatever it was. And then that has, ebbed and waned. It's ebbed and flowed over the years. I think right now, as an adult, like games just don't really cater to the things that I'm interested in. It's just like other people or developing empathy or, like seeing things from a different perspective. Like the idea of competition is not as appealing to me as it was, in my teens or 20s. So I do find that I play fewer video games than I used to, but I'm also like, trying to make the sort of games that like I now want to play.
Yeah.
I think over time we'll see more games that are exploring, like different areas of human experience.
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead,
Kyle. I was gonna say, so as far as, so you play fewer games. What games are you playing right now, or have you played recently that have caught your interest?
I think the last game that really connected with me was Universal Paperclips, which is a free browser game that looks like just a clicker. You just click on things to make paperclips. But yeah, it sort of develops in surprising ways. And I've played through a lot of the kind of giant games of the last year or two, like Mario Odyssey and Zelda, and things that I really like about a lot of those games. But they didn't really connect to me in the way that this browser game connected. I was really surprised by that. I mean, I think it's hard also playing games now as a game developer because a lot of my attention does go into how did they do that, and what are like the mechanical elements there, and something like Zelda. I feel like there's so many really wonderful touches at a mechanics level, the moment to moment, like the way that things work, and then there are other things that just feel I don't know, like holistically broken and odd. That like you have this whole world that's so rich, and then it ends, with an encounter with Ganon, who's this like non-character. You don't know anything about him. He's just like a random dude with spider legs for some reason. It's such a letdown, and nobody complains about it. I don't know. It's an odd industry.
I think like another big thing though with a lot of these AAA games is they are, I don't know how you put it, they're long, I guess. And people with busy schedules have a hard time getting through that within a couple weeks. At least for me, it took me like 2 months just to get through the entire game.
Yeah, I had the luxury of having nothing else going on, so I got through it in 1 week, where I just sat in an Airbnb in Kyoto, where I was on vacation. I was just like, this is what I'm doing this week. I am playing all of Zelda, and I'm watching all of Miyazaki in chronological order, and I did it.
Oh, very nice. Props to you.
That was a vacation for me. Yeah.
Hey man, it sounds like a perfect vacation.
Yeah. It was a good palate cleanser after 4.5 years of making What Remains of Edith Finch.
Yeah, very cool. So being a part of Giant Sparrow, you guys are a team of 10 or 12?
It varies. So at the very beginning, we were 3 on Edith Finch. And then at our peak, we were like around 15 people, I think, full time, and then more contractors. And then towards the end, we tapered off again.
So what are like the perks of being within a small development team like that, as opposed, being with maybe a team of 100 people or plus? Is there anything like any advantages to working with just a smaller team like that for you?
Oh yeah, no, it's I mean tons of advantages in terms of the number of meetings that we have, which is far fewer. Communication is a lot easier when you have a smaller group of people, and even with like 6 or 7 people, it's amazing how many times you can have whole conversations. Everybody's in the room, everybody's hearing the same thing, and everybody has a different interpretation of what you actually agreed on. So it's a lot easier to find those problems and resolve them, and hopefully everybody also feels a lot more ownership in what they're doing, because they get to own significant chunks of
what
the
they
game.
did.
Yeah, that's really cool. Seems like a tighter group of people, and just I couldn't even imagine after releasing that game how you guys felt of what remains of Edith Finch. Like
Tired, I think.
Yeah.
The first reaction.
Yeah.
Satisfied, hopefully too.
So, talking about what remains of Edith Finch and The Unfinished Swan, both have incredible narration throughout the games. But focusing on what remains of Edith Finch, how did you guys come about, creating a game like that? Especially since it's quite a bit different with the playstyle as opposed to Unfinished Swan.
Yeah, I mean, we just sort of backed into it. We had this overarching concept of making a game that explored what it felt like to encounter the sublime. That initially went back to my experience growing up in Washington State and scuba diving and seeing the bottom of the ocean sloping away into a kind of seemingly infinite darkness, and what it feels like to simultaneously be in the presence of something very beautiful, but also to feel overwhelmed. That to me was like what the sublime meant, and I was really interested in exploring a game that could evoke that for players, and everything else just kind of followed from there. So initially, we started off very literally, making a scuba diving simulator, and then that quickly went off the rails and became something very else, very very different from that. Partly because when we were looking around, for inspiration, like how do you communicate what the sublime is? We hit on this genre of literature called weird fiction that, like H.P. Lovecraft would be the most prominent one, but, there's a lot of other folks like Neil Gaiman and Lord Dunsany and others that wrote these really amazing short stories that, for me, were really effective ways of expressing this encounter with the sublime. So I thought, well, if it worked so well for these guys, making collections of short stories to communicate something, then why don't we structure our game like that? Because when you're dealing with something that is so overwhelming, I think it helps to be able to reset, the whole world afterwards. And short stories are one way to do that. And so, it's kind of how we ended up with this game. There's also a book called 100 Years of Solitude that was hugely inspirational for the game. And, that's a series of, it's a book, but it's effectively a series of short stories about these different members of the family. And that gave us, a lot of guidance into how these things might work.
So when you're trying to make a game such as Edith Finch and approaching the story, how does something like That House come about? Because when I was trying to describe the game to, family and friends, I'm like, it's just, it's a story, you're exploring this house and these different families, and you're, basically experiencing their backstories and their life. So how did you approach that? As opposed, not so much as a, you talk about the ideas coming from like different short stories trying to get a point across, but how, I'm more curious about the house itself and how,
Sure.
and how that come about. And to that idea came about to try and explore the story itself as well.
Yeah. The house, is a good metaphor really for the development of the game as a whole. It was a very organic process that evolved in unexpected ways over a long period with a lot of different forces. And I think you can see that architecturally in the way that the house looks now. It looks like a thing that was not built by one person, but was built,
Right.
over generations. And, the forces that went into our idea of what the house would be. I think we were trying to find something that suggested time and that would combine aspects of familiarity with the unknown. So essentially, like these polar opposites of civilization and the messy, organic, natural world. Finding something that was comforting, like it's a house, but then that had grown in somewhat monstrous ways. I think those are the main elements that went into it, and
Okay.
then in terms of the actual like process of how do you make a thing like that, it's just a lot of me going onto Flickr and looking for weird houses and finding little details. And there's actually a lot of houses that have been made over the years that are somewhat, Finch-like, things where people just don't know when to stop. They keep
Yeah.
expanding these things. So I just put together tons of images that kind of hint at what I'm going for, and then I think in the case of the house, I also wrote up a doc, like just a 1-page brief on what I was shooting for. And if you ever need to describe the Finch house, the way that I did it was just ramshackle majesty. That was what I gave to the artists ultimately. Those 2 words that they could wrap their head around. And then the concept artist, went off for a couple days and did some sketches, and we actually honed in on it pretty quickly for the overall shape of it. We also knew that we wanted the player to end the game at the top of the house, because there's so many confusing elements in the game and so much is unknown intentionally. We wanted the broad strokes of what you as a player are doing, what your goals are, to be crystal clear, so that people would feel comfortable wading into a lot of the unknown, realizing that there was something that they were at least heading towards. It's like they're wading into a swamp, but they can see the light at the end of the swamp. So that fed into also just at a kind of functional level what we needed from the house.
Okay, very nice. Yeah.
I was gonna say, over here in West Virginia, we have a lot of homes that aren't to that size, but definitely have the clutter that house had in it.
Yeah.
Yep. Um, yeah, I remember the first time I played through the game, just approaching the house, and it's overwhelming with how big it is, and you just see how it keeps crawling up and up into the sky. And I just thinking today, I was just thinking about this interview in particular. You know, the model that you guys went for was perfect, and
Oh,
how
thanks.
you created it, because you could have done it with just like a old Victorian mansion or something, just something basic like that. At least I think you could have just built this big house and just put rooms in. But the way you guys created it, it's almost Dr. Seuss-esque, I guess.
Yeah, no, and I think when you talk about, oh, you could have done this Victorian mansion, we very explicitly were struggling against that. There's a rich history of these like old Guillermo del Toro talked about them as like the grandams of the horror genre, like these haunted houses, like these Gothic cathedrals and things like Shirley Jackson's, The House on Haunted Hill, or The Haunting rather, and like I love a lot of those movies and references, but we wanted to make it very clear that this was not some kind of supernatural or like kind of Addams Family thing, that it was much more suburban and familiar, and a place that you could imagine actually being built. Because the game goes off in such bizarre directions, we wanted to ground it somewhere. And so yeah, we tried really hard to make the house not feel Victorian, even though it's doing a lot of the same kinds of things that a Victorian house might do in one of the old haunted house tales. Like, it is overwhelming, and feels somewhat old. But yeah, we're very conscious of trying to not go too far in that Victorian house.
Yeah. Well, I mean, kudos to you guys, because like I said, you nailed the design of it. It was almost breathtaking when you first
Oh,
approach it.
thanks. Yeah, it's
Um,
funny how much of that actually has to do with the pathing up to the house.
mhm.
And I think this is true of buildings too. A lot of what what we do as game designers is really about the experience, which is so contextually dependent on all these elements. But I think the level designer Chris Bell did a really great job of winding you through, where you get like a glimpse of the house, but then you really don't see the house when you're walking up to it for a long, long time. And
Right.
then there's this very immediate break in the trees, and you come out, and it's like bam, right there. And it would have had much less of an impact if it was something that you saw the whole way through, and it's just like, yeah, I'm getting closer to this thing. But having this short, sharp shock at the end is what really delivers the power.
Um, so, like going back to where you're talking about the path up to the house, uh, the elk you run into in that path. Is there anything symbolic about that, or is it just? I always feel like it just stands there so majestic looking.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we did that before or after, like where Sam's story was in development, but it's the same. I think it's meant to be a deer. It's the same buck, it's the same buck that appears in Sam's story, and it's also the same horns that appear on the wall.
Okay.
I think they're in Sam's room, and yeah, I mean, we wanted to create a moment where it felt like you were encountering nature on its own terms.
Okay.
And something that felt very powerful, but also kind of distant from you. So
Yeah.
I think that's and majestic would be a good word, but also just given the nature of game development, part of the reason that we made it and that we made it feature so prominently is that we sort of already had it. Because we've done it for this other story, and we could economize there and make this really nice looking animal that could be used multiple places.
Yeah. Very cool. Every time I saw it, I always thought there's got to be something behind this animal here, because it's just I don't know. It's just I don't know. There's just something about it. I can't put my thumb on it, but kind of getting into the story. Uh, Edith Finch, uh, personally, like hit me in a way that no other game has as far as emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at the end of the game, I just sat there and stared at the screen and maybe shed a tear or two. Just it was just such a good game, and I started playing it immediately again after that first playthrough. Um, the stories within the game with each family member. Is there any in of the family members that kind of connected with you personally, or any that stood out to you? More than.
Yeah, it's a good question. In terms of like the story as a whole, I think the one that for me feels like the that I'm in some ways most proud of, I guess, would be Calvin's story, because it ended up being such a nice distillation of everything that the game is about,
Mhm.
and so short. Like I can't imagine it appearing in any other game. So I think I love that, because for me it kind of crystallizes what the whole game is about.
Mhm.
In terms of characters who I would identify with, I guess Molly
Yeah.
would be the one that I feel like a very strong kinship with that desire to go out and explore things, even if part of you knows that this is not going to end well. And I think
Right.
that's a pretty good synopsis of game development itself.
Yeah. The way that you guys approached her story was visually satisfying,
Mm-hmm.
and just the gameplay through that as well. Yeah.
No, thanks.
Now, was it difficult at all trying to try and get all these stories to be able to tell one massive story overall, to try and connect them all together?
Oh yeah, no, that was a good year or so at the end, trying to thread them together, because even though they share a lot of similar kind of themes and tones in terms of trying to evoke the sublime and giving players an experience they've never had before of the unknown, they weren't really written in such a way that there would be an overarching story, because it's just, I think it would be too hard, to make both of those things at the same time. Like, it is hard enough to make any kind of satisfying story. So we kind of started from the smallest, most approachable unit, which was, the short stories themselves. Like, let's just make this one satisfying. Okay, great. Let's make this one satisfying. And then, like once we had, all of the stories at some level of completion, we could step back and kind of do a lot of internal and kind of soul searching and discuss, like, what is it that all of these stories feel like they're about. Like, we had an idea that it would be about the sublime initially, but I don't know that that's really, for most players, what it feels like all of these things are really about. Like, I think, the game ended up becoming something different than what we had set out to make. And, what is there now is much more about, family and memories and stories. And so we had an overarching story in the beginning, and we just realized, later on, like, well, that's not really true anymore. Like, it kind of works. There's a beginning and an end to it, but it's not really, it doesn't feel like it comes out of what the player is really experiencing. So, then we spent the last year just, revising that, and, the characters of Edie and Dawn didn't really come together, until like 9 months before we shipped. Like, their central conflict, which is, the main driver for Edith's story, did not exist until pretty late. And there are pieces of that, but it didn't really crystallize because we didn't have a sense of what the game really was until we were looking at it.
That's very interesting. And you wouldn't be able to tell playing through it, because everything flows so seamlessly and everything connects so well. So that is very interesting.
Oh, thanks.
You're very welcome. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. Kyle and I are both, we love Nintendo. We especially love the Nintendo Switch. And you brought out that you've played Zelda and Odyssey. Can we expect a project maybe soon from Giant Sparrow on the Switch, maybe?
We have nothing to announce.
Okay.
Doing Edith Finch on the Switch would be a massive technical undertaking in order to make an inferior version of the game. So I think that's probably unlikely.
Okay.
Unfortunately. Like, I would love to be able to play Edith Finch on the Switch, but I think the hardware is just not really set up to do the kind of, massive amounts of level streaming and, whatever else that the game needs to do. But in the future, I would, I'd love to do something that could run on the Switch, but there's nothing specific that I have in mind or that is,
fair enough
in development. Yeah.
I had to ask, I had to ask.
I appreciate it.
So, Edith Finch, it got, tons of praises. It even got Best Narrative at the Video Game Awards. So congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
And on top of that, tons and tons of nominations. So where do you guys go from here? How do you follow up with something such as Edith Finch getting so much praise? Is there added pressure to make another project that's, just as good? Or are you guys just still trying to just ride this wave for now before you're starting on the next project?
Oh, I mean, I feel like, for me, Edith Finch is dead. Like, it's a thing that I participated in and am very satisfied with, but, whatever life it has is now its own. Or maybe not dead. I mean, it's really the opposite, right? Like, it's been born. Like, it is out there in the world, and people are having their own experiences of it. And, I was just kind of the caretaker of it in the end. And so for the next thing, it's just we're starting over. It will be completely different. And eventually I would not be surprised if, kind of loops back around and there are, a lot of similarities between whatever our next game is and, The Unfinished Swan and What Remains of Edith Finch. I think that's just part of like having a creator-driven studio, is that like whatever my obsessions are, they end up kind of bubbling out, into, in ways that I don't necessarily predict. But it won't be, in the Edith Finch world or house or anything. So there won't be like a literal connection, but probably, some tonal overlap.
Okay, fair enough. I was just, a lot of times when, someone gets a ton of praise or, whether it's a studio, whether it's big or small, whenever that next project comes out, I mean, technically Edith Finch is your guys' second project, but still,
Mhm.
it's almost like as if, with their next project, that follow-up project either doesn't live up to the hype or it's good, but it's not as good, so, we
Yeah, I mean, I
definitely
think
look forward to
in our
where you guys
case,
come out next.
right. Like it's a little different because I would expect that the next thing is going to be so different
Hmm.
that it's not going to be easily comparable.
Yeah.
I mean, not that it's going to be like a MOBA or Match 3 or something, but it will be sufficiently different from Edith Finch that I don't think people will be like, oh, it's not quite as good as Edith Finch. It'll be like, oh, it's completely different. I liked it less or I liked it more.
Hmm.
Those are fine reactions to have, but that's one of the nice things, I guess, about starting over every time that you don't have to worry as much about people comparing it because the experiences are going to be so different.
That's totally fair enough. So closing out, do you have any words of advice out there for anyone that may be listening, for any aspiring game developers? Any advice you might have them on how to get started, or maybe some pitfalls that you went through that you would hate for anyone else to go through? Anything like that. Anything.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage anyone who wants to make games to try to learn a little bit about all of the different disciplines, like particularly, a little bit of programming, a little bit of 3D modeling and animation, and a bit of design, because I think no matter what you end up doing, it's really helpful to be able to make your own prototypes, like both for you to explore an idea, but then also for you to communicate your idea. And often those things are the same thing. Like when there are a lot of times where, I think I know what it is that I'm trying to say, but by the time I've made a little, mock-up animation or, a really crummy prototype, in order to communicate that to someone, I've actually learned a lot more about that thing myself.
Hmm.
And, especially on a small team, but I think this is quite true on larger teams as well. Like the more different hats you can wear, like the more pieces you can make yourself, the more you can contribute, and the more your ideas can get out there to the rest of the team. Like it's so hard to communicate anything, but like in game design or development, if you can see it move, like there's a lot less ambiguity.
Hmm.
Like you can have a conversation for an hour and feel like you both understand what was trying to be said, but then as soon as it's actually moving and alive and interactive, there's just so many other questions that you realize come up and that weren't answered. So yeah, anyone who wants to make games, I think it's helpful to spend a little bit of time and just get to the point where you can make a really version of you know like a level design, or a really version of an animation, or a really
Hmm.
version of a piece of code.
That's really awesome. I've tried making a game myself. It's a lot harder than expected. So anyone that can do it, hats off to you, and hats off to you, Ian. For being able to wear several hats and still
Oh, thanks.
pump something out. So
Yeah, I mean,
huge props
it
to
was
you.
really, really helpful to go back to grad school, honestly. Like, even though the school itself was, like I didn't learn that much in class, just
Hmm.
having the free time to dig into it was really helpful, because you're right, like, it's so hard. I mean, there are times where I was near tears learning things, because it's such a mountain, it's like very steep in the beginning. But if you stick with it and you're making something that you're really interested in, which
Hmm.
I think is so important when you're first learning, that you're not just doing a tutorial that someone else has created for you, but that you're actually trying to solve like your own problem. I think
Hmm.
that's the energy that has a chance of pushing you over that mountain, and then seeing the sadly even higher mountains that are beyond, but at least making some progress.
Oh, I can agree with that on so many levels. I just don't have the time, unfortunately. But if you have the time,
Yeah, no, I mean, you just have to make the time if
yeah.
it's important to you.
Hmm.
And just be realistic. Like, oh, there are times where this is going to be so unpleasant that I will be near tears. Yeah, and that's just the nature of it. But it does get better.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Kyle, that's all I had. Unless you have another question or anything to ask Ian.
No, but that's everything, man. Ian, we cannot thank you enough for coming on here.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a
Yeah,
pleasure.
it was a pleasure having you on here. It was just everything I wanted and more. Where can our audience, keep up with Giant Sparrow on the interwebs?
Probably Twitter would be the best place. We're at Giant Sparrow. And
Okay.
we also have a website, giantsparrow.com, with an irregularly updated blog.
Okay. Well,
I know
again,
that game.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for coming on here, and hopefully we can have you back on in the future at some point.
Cool. All right. I'll see you for the next game.
Yep.
See you for the next game.
Bye.
All right. Bye.